Monsieur le ministre.
Minister, dear Thomas, Dean of Charles University, who is hosting us today, Madam the Deputy Dean, Director of the Academy of Sciences, CIFRE's Director, dear Jérôme Murtaugh, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. 30 years have passed since 1989. A generation who has gone from euphoria to doubt. I am profoundly European. And let me tell you that Europe is what drives my political engagement. And I remember the enthusiasm and the jubilation of those days that in the autumn 1985 would change the face of our continent and would move all peoples of Europe without exception. But what strikes me today, as Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France, is that as each decade passes, we are less enthusiastic and less united in celebrating the commemorations of 1989, and this at a time when there has never been a greater need for Europe that is so strong, free, true to its principles and unified. That is why I wanted to come here to Prague, to Charles University in the heart of Europe, to reflect with you on the meaning of 1989 and what this year can tell us about who we are today and on the European ambition that we must continue to pursue. The message I came to share with you today is a message from one European to the other Europeans about this very special year, a message about its hopes and its disillusions, but also a message about the future of the spirit of 1989. The disillusionment that some of you have described today should be of concern to historians and researchers. This is precisely one of the subjects of this conference held by the French Research Center in Humanities and Social Sciences in Prague, together with the Academy of Sciences and Charles University, which I would like to thank for inviting me to speak before you today. There is indeed a ground for the historians and researchers to be concerned, but also for the politicians to be, because this gets us to face some fundamental issues. The many memories of our history, the autonomy and security of Europe, and the relation between the sovereignty of states and European sovereignty. And addressing this disillusion, restoring the thread and the energy of our European dream, such is our shared challenge. But let me start by telling you what I have not come to do in Prague. I'm a political leader at an academic conference on social sciences, and we each have our responsibilities. They are important, but they are different. I, therefore, did not come to give you a history lesson. Researchers must be able to work freely on this period of history as they do on all others. This year, we will commemorate not only 1989, but also the 80 years of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the organization of Nazi and Soviet occupations of Europe, which occurred simultaneously and successively. Because the temptation is great for certain people to conduct a history policy in order to manipulate the past for their own ends, to steer things up, to add to the confusion, and to further a specific ideology. But today we're faced with an additional danger of history being rewritten on the basis of reinterpreted national interests and narratives. Too many legends presented as official truths have motivated bloody rifts on our continent so that we remain indifferent to their resurgence. If we are to return to the ideals of Europe of the Enlightenment, we must preserve critical thinking within our societies. And if the truth and the counter-truths are considered to be the same, the word truth itself will be emptied of its own meaning. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, 23 states, including France, have asked that an observatory on history teaching in Europe be created at the initiative of the French presidency of the Council of Europe, taking stock neutrally and factually of school curricula and textbooks. This observatory will promote dialogue and all teachings, prevent racist, xenophobic, and anti-Semitic discourse from re-emerging, and work to bring peoples closer together. And perhaps we'll be able to show that, while respecting our singular histories, there is also a history that brings us together. The history of our continent and of this European spirit we have inherited and must safeguard. As one of the greatest French historians said, Marc Bloch, the misunderstanding of the present is the inevitable consequence of ignorance of the past. It can also be the consequence of the manipulation of history. One of the European principles is academic freedom, and if this freedom is threatened, democracy and peace will be threatened as well. But our political responsibility, however, differs from the scientific responsibility. The political responsibility is to build on the basis of your research work a shared European memory, adhering to two principles. First, strict respect for national memories that should be recognized and heard. Our national narratives are built around selective references to the past. A same date can resonate very differently from one state to another, one European state to another. Therefore, the year 1968 does not have the same resonance in French, Czech, and Polish memories. I will give you another example. We just celebrated the centenary of the end of the First World War in Paris a year ago. In France, 1918 signifies the armistice and relief for French people. However, in your region, until 1923, it was indeed the collapse of empires, wars, revolutions, displacements of peoples, and pogroms that marked this period. And even 1989, for a French person or a German person, that will bring to mind images of the wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall, before that very moving moment of the human chain which spanned in late August 1989 three Baltic states. We never recognized the annexation of these states, and they had yet again to regain their sovereignty. So this understanding of our different national memories must be at the heart of European integration. All Europeans, including French people, need to listen and understand that. Second principle. This does not mean that we support projects to manipulate history to their own ends. It does not mean that we encourage historical relativism or revisionism. Nor does it mean that we promote a unifying narrative imposed by leaders. It does not mean that we create a single history, but rather develop a European historical awareness based on the belief that our national histories must form a basis for a common awareness of what it means to be Europeans, finally united in our diversity. And let's keep these words of Victor Hugo in mind. Memories are of strength. When night attempts to return, we must light up the great dates as we would light torches. Commemorating 1989 and reflecting on its promises together, those that have come true and those that have disappointed us can only strengthen our determination to build a common future in peace and democracy. If I'm here today, it is because, therefore, I'm convinced that the European memory must ascend to the polyphony of national memories. I'm convinced that we have yet to reconcile ourselves with the diversity of our memories, to better understand how this diversity has made Europe what it is. When he talked about the tragedy of Central Europe in 1983, Milan Kundera was not speaking only of Soviet domination. He regretted most of all that Central Europe no longer existed in the eyes of the West other than as part of the Soviet Empire. Differences should not mask what unites us, neither today nor in the past. What unites us are common destiny and the universal enlightenment principles. And I believe that it is by including all of these voices in the collective narrative that we must build together. And by getting these voices to communicate with one another within this narrative, that we will be able to fully understand what 1989 means in the history of the Europeans. And if I'm stressing this point, it is because we need to understand where we come from so that together we can decide where we're headed. Please allow me now to share with you what 1989 means to a French person and why I wanted to come here to Prague to celebrate the turning point of 1989. A year in which, after 50 years of Nazi, then Soviet occupation, Central European countries regained their freedom and their sovereignty, and in which the reunification of Europe started. 1989 bestowed three great things upon us: freedom, sovereignty, and unity. 1989 clearly marks the return of freedom, liberties, the end of totalitarian oppression and of the destruction of the individual, the triumph of democracy and the rule of law. In other words, the establishment of a state that no longer oppresses but that protects. That is indeed the meaning of the European project that Jean Monnet first described. We're not forming coalitions of states, we're uniting men. And he could have added free men. Let us not forget that there can be no democracy without a regime that protects rights and liberties and that ensures right over might. Those who equate so-called liberal democracy to tyranny over minorities, and some do that. Those who equate so-called liberal democracy to multiculturalism and contemporary traditions are not only sophists, but they are also suffering from amnesia. They forget that it was here in Prague and in Warsaw and Budapest that men and women resisted totalitarianism and fought for their freedom at the cost of their own lives. So first of all, I came here to pay tribute to those who 30 years ago rose up and imposed on dumbfounded governments the power of the powerless, to quote the famous words by Václav Havel. Václav Havel is a name that I cannot say here without thinking of the morning of, not like Thomas said earlier, of the morning of the 9th of December 1988 and the historic meeting between François Mitterrand and 8 Czech dissidents, including one of whom was to become the first president of a liberated country. And I'm proud, very proud, that France recognized his struggle. And the following year, we were many in France to watch with admiration and enthusiasm the peoples of Central Europe who took control of their destinies and who chose to write their own history. And write, as a matter of fact, not just their history, but our common history, that of a reunified Europe. And with them, I would also like to salute the memory of the dissidents whose spirit of resistance in a way paved the way for this upheaval. Thinking of Jan Palach, Václav Havel, of course, Jak Pachoka, Father Populuszko, and many others, including the students in Budapest in 1956 who fought for freedom. I said 1989 freedom, but I also know that 1989 marks the regained independence and sovereignty for all the countries under Soviet control at the time. The 1989 revolutions ended the Brezhnev Doctrine, this theory of limited sovereignty drawn up after the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Soviets and their allies on the 21st of August 1968. after huge hopes were raised by the Prague Spring. And it was again here in Prague that this doctrine was done away with when the Warsaw Pact was officially dissolved on the 1st of July 1991. This sovereignty, restored 30 years ago, should make us attentive to reticence that is expressed here or elsewhere regarding the notion of European sovereignty. And I'll come back to this point later. I do understand the attachment of former Eastern Bloc countries to national sovereignty, this valuable thing that they have only enjoyed on and off in the past. This is also why those who must choose their alliances or their lack of alliance are the countries concerned and the peoples constituting them, and not third parties. Finally, the freedom regained in 1989 is that of the entire European continent. As I've already said, I prefer the word reunification of Europe, which brings us together, to enlargement, which distances us from each other. To call things by the wrong name is to add to the world's misfortune, Albert Camus once said, and something that is wrongly named cannot be thought of its exact terms. Because this regained freedom and history which you have written with courage, you, the Czech, Slovak, Polish, Hungarian, and Romanian peoples, and more, were also ours. You returned them to us. The freedom of Europe, including Western Europe, was limited by the servitude of Central Europe and the Soviet buffer zone. 1989 marked the end of Yalta, an order to which we were subjected, but that France never accepted. More than a return to Europe, which Central European countries had never left, as Milan Kundera noted, it affirmed a geographical but also cultural and therefore political fact that was sometimes complacently neglected, the unity of the European continent. And I'd like to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, to echo what Thomas was saying earlier, Eastern Europe has never as such existed. It was a fabrication of the Cold War, not a relevant division arising from Europe's long history. With 1989, for the first time, Europe, which had long been deprived of a vital portion of itself, had the opportunity to play a role in its history and no longer merely be subjected to it. And those who use the lack of unity in Europe today as an argument to criticize the European project are wrong. The unity of our continent is not an abstract idea or a political slogan or an intellectual's musing. It is a tangible reality for all European citizens who enjoy on a daily basis this freedom of movement, which was gained at such a high price. And perhaps one of the most disastrous consequences of the 2015 refugee crisis are these borders that have been closed, these walls that have been erected, and this challenging of the area of free movement created by the Schengen agreements. Because Schengen is, with the euro, or in another area, Erasmus, one of the most tangible and visible signs of a European unification. And these achievements are as necessary as they are fragile as is European integration. When faced with doomsayers, therefore, who are so ready to give lectures, often motivated by elections, it's important to always remember what together we were able to build to the benefit of our peoples. The future of this memory that draws on several sources of 1989 is, of course, our common European project. And I would like to now share with you the conclusions I have drawn from this reflection on our common history for our common future. The project that France promotes with you is a project of European humanism which begins with the uncompromising defense of our values and our principles. It is a project of social, economic, and fiscal convergence, for there is an urgent need to address disillusions and bridge European divides. They do not constitute a new wall between two Europes coexisting within the European Union. Inequalities, populist temptations, and the loss of meaning and common references are for all of us shared problems. we should consider them to be common problems. This is a project of European power working for our peoples in the face of the excesses of globalization and challenges of international competition. More than ever, international unrest and brutal expression of power struggles are structuring life on the planet. Faced with this situation, Europe has an alternative: to accept it and risk seeing its own choices be dictated, or to assert itself, to make a difference every time it so requires for its identity and its principles. And with no hesitation, I choose the second option. Why? Because we have known since the time of Paul Valéry that civilizations are mortal. How? By having Europe to take charge of its own destiny. And overall, it is an obvious fact that I need to recall. We can only hope to complete this project over time if we are able to guarantee our security. That's why I believe that we cannot bring up 1989, when Europe was reunified around democratic principles and humanist values, without mentioning 1990 and the adoption of the Charter of Paris for a new Europe. What was its aim? To build European collective security by putting to work the 10 principles adopted in 1975 in Helsinki. This ambition to build European collective security, which was so present in the early 1990s, gradually faded away. This ambition needs to be revived. Little by little, we have seen the unraveling of the components that help establish the security architecture set out in the Charter of Paris, and we have witnessed a methodical effort to deconstruct, which has led to the progressive, systematic, and not nearly comprehensive dismantling of all the violence regulation instruments. From confidence-building measures to arms limitation and reduction treaties, whatever their category. And all things considered, a danger void is opening up. And the threat of conflict, be it accidental or deliberate, is looming over our continent once again. The growing number of military incidents is proof of this. Remaining true to the promises of 1989, being reasonable and being prudent, means wanting to resolve this instability and reducing these risks. Since the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, which showed Europeans what their own responsibilities were in ensuring the security of their own continent, other threats have emerged. And I'm not only thinking of hyper-violence of terrorism. In Europe, war is back. In Georgia, then in Ukraine. Chemical weapons have been used on the soil of a major European city. Cyber attacks have sought to sabotage and undermine the foundations of our democracies, our electoral processes, our public debates. Some people seem to have resigned themselves to this, but we Europeans, after the horrible tragedies that brought devastation to our continent throughout the 20th century, cannot accept them. That is why we cannot content ourselves with the status quo regarding Russia, whose aggressive actions have shaken up our strategic environment over the past 10 years. So what do we need to guarantee our security and return to our promises of November 1990, when in Paris this charter to overhaul the principles of European security architecture was adopted? The response is that, first of all, we need, above all, the transatlantic relationship. We, the French people, also want to preserve it. We also need it politically, militarily, and strategically, and particularly in the military operations we're conducting in the Levant and in the Sahel region, with the presence of some forces from the Czech Republic, but which it does not rule out considering developments with lucidity and drawing all the ensuing conclusions. Everyone understands that the time when Europe could entirely entrust others with taking care of its security and depend exclusively on them has passed. And this movement did not start when President Trump was elected. what we call in Europe strategic autonomy, and which in fact corresponds exactly to the notion of burden sharing. That is a condition for a strong and credible transatlantic relationship. And as a matter of fact, some of our American partners suggest that our ability to act for ourselves is precisely what makes France Washington's best partner when it comes to defense. We also need, on top of the Atlantic bond, we also need NATO to remain what it ultimately was for every one of us after 1989, a stabilizing force. That is why France wanted to start discussion of the current malaise in the Atlantic Alliance. The summit that was just held in London launched genuine strategic discussion in NATO. We both attended that meeting. And this was necessary in the very name of continuity and consolidation of the transatlantic relationship. The absolute condition for a strong Atlantic alliance is now that Europeans act more proactively and shoulder more of their responsibilities within an overhauled and rebalanced alliance. There cannot be European defense without NATO, just as there cannot be a credible and sustainable NATO without a strengthening of European defense commitments over the long term. We have fought this for a long time, and France is committed concretely to NATO's deterrence and defense posture, for example, in Baltic states and in the Black Sea. France respects the security interests of all of our European partners, which it has made entirely its own. It will always defend them as an absolute priority. And this is indeed what President Macron said in London 2 days ago. We are and will always be uncompromising when our sovereignty and that of our partners and allies is at stake. Our allies can count on France, on its engagement, and on its armed forces, always. Thirdly, we need our security to be organized in Europe so that it can ensure strategic stability across the continent. This is why NATO's approach of a deterrence and dialogue has been used since 1967. It is also the approach of President Macron's proposal for European security and confidence building architecture. Let us put it clearly here. If we want to roll back the systematic dismantling I just mentioned, it is with Russia with whom we must re-establish dialogue, without taking a soft line or being naive, to defend the security interests of all Europeans and by entering into power struggles every time it is needed. But we cannot simply ignore our geography. The initiatives that we have taken, we have created in strict compliance with agreed European principles. And we do not intend to neglect the security interests of our European partners. On the contrary, as they are also ours, as President Macron reiterated last week. This is the reason why we would like the Europeans to deal with the major strategic, military and nuclear issues that concern their security directly. These include the reconstruction of a legal framework and transparency that should limit the risks of involuntary military escalation, set limits on the capacity of our potential adversaries, and thus reduce the threat. With the suspension of the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, with the end of the INF Treaty, and the uncertainties looming ahead of 2021 over the New START Treaty, Europe could find itself becoming the theater of a relentless and lawless military and nuclear competition. We have not experienced such a situation since the end of the 1960s, after the Berlin and Cuba crisis. This overhaul of arms control in Europe is our responsibility as Europeans if we want to avoid becoming a simple arena for confrontation between third powers. We therefore hope that such European reflection can be launched shortly as a European contribution to the strategic reflection of NATO and defense of our interests and vision of the international order. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, we need to restore the spirit and intention of Helsinki and the spirit and intention of the Charter of Paris. When the Helsinki principles are ignored or violated, it is always at the expense of what we have been trying to build here in Europe. The last 30 years have shown that when a spheres of influence approach re-emerges, the sovereign equality of states, respect for rights inherent in sovereignty, and the freedom to belong or not to belong to international organizations and thus alliances are fluted. When a sole border is challenged by force, it is the inviolability of all our borders that is affected, and with it the principles of non-use of force. When the opposition is imprisoned, when fundamental or academic freedoms are crushed, human rights and democracy are trampled. That is why I think that these principles and the need to see them applied is clearly relevant in today's context. It is now up to us to make improvements to what was attempted 30 years ago. At some point in the coming year, I will try to launch the discussion at the European level so that we can address this subject together by next November, when the third Paris Peace Forum will be held. Ultimately, as regards security and other issues, our most pressing challenge is to build genuine European sovereignty. We must make it an absolute priority. And we've already started working on this. And thanks to our efforts, Europe is finally beginning to accept its power so that it can remain free to make its own choices and also to promote its own values. This common sovereignty does not take anything away from national sovereignties. In a dangerous and overly competitive world, it protects all of them. Choosing one does not mean giving up the other. Quite the opposite is true. Of course, I understand that countries that up to until just 30 years ago belonged to the Eastern Bloc are fiercely attached to their sovereignty. But I would like to tell them that European sovereignty is not a return to the Holy Roman Empire, nor a return to Brussels' version of the Brezhnev Doctrine. It is the possibility for every state to remain independent in a world in which power struggles can be seen in every area. And I would like to stress that a real European is not someone who denies the existence and importance of nation-states, just as a real patriot is not someone who rejects and has given up hope on Europe. A patriotic European or European patriot is someone, to the contrary, who knows that without strong nations, the European project is weakened, and that without a strong Europe, our nations are weaker. Lastly, if we are not to be passive as the 21st century unrolls, there is an area in which Europeans must absolutely master to ensure their sovereignty. And I discussed it with my counterpart, Thomas, earlier today. Digital technology. Because in this area as well, there is a real risk that others will impose their choices on us, be it countries or companies. In this new space of conflicting interests, we can see more and more sophisticated power strategies being used, which aim to attack and destabilize. Another possible risk to us is dependence on the technology of others, from 5G to artificial intelligence. It is finally the risk that practices of certain major private sector players, which are not subject to regulation, breach the rights of our citizens, especially when it comes to respect for privacy. We must therefore take action among Europeans to build European digital sovereignty, which is both effective and in line with our values. In other words, that is neither isolationist nor dominating, but that enables us to decide our future freely. It is important to remember that we're not starting from scratch. We have technical infrastructure, administrations, and innovation ecosystems. We have a vision for the digital world we want, a digital world that is free, open, and safe, We have the ability to promote it. This is what we have done with the General Data Protection Regulation. And we are now working to do the same regarding digital taxation. I believe we should work on implementing 4 projects to gradually build digital sovereignty in Europe and advocate a European vision of digital technology and human rights in the digital era. First of all, we need to begin by bolstering security in cyberspace. Like I said, security is the foundation of our sovereignty. Espionage, sabotage, and intrusion take on new dimensions in the digital age and are violations that we cannot accept. And to protect ourselves from these threats and, if necessary, respond, we need to have our own capacities. We also need to strengthen the stability of the environment in which these threats are emerging. Cyberspace. We have already launched several initiatives. They include, for example, the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, which brings together governments and companies to determine joint principles that will help to better protect individuals' rights and strengthen international norms. And the Christchurch Call as well, the Christchurch Call to prevent the internet being used for terrorist purposes. And we can also help other countries protect themselves without having to be subservient to a cyber power. We also need to win the battle of innovation. In just a few years, Europe has found its way back to the path of digital innovation. Several European cities, including Paris, have become innovative ecosystems. Europe needs to rebuild its forces and propose European solutions to the challenges of tomorrow. Smart cities, connected health, and autonomous transport. We must identify crucial sectors and areas, from 5G to issues related to digital identity and cryptocurrencies. And of course, we need to progress yet further in research in its ties with business. I believe that we must continue to move forward in implementing a genuine single digital market. But that's not the end of it. We also need to work and hardly so to strengthen European digital technology in terms of data storage, big data management, and cloud computing. This is key to ensuring our values and our citizens' rights are respected. Thirdly, we must also consolidate our role as a normative power. As we did with the General Data Protection Regulation, we need to continue to innovate when it comes to rules in order to ensure predictability and trust in the sector, but also to impose adherence to certain fundamental principles. I'm thinking of data protection, regulation of artificial intelligence, regulation of content, security and trust in cyberspace. Regarding all of these subjects, we will, my dear Thomas, need to build majority coalitions. We know how to do that. Lastly and fourthly, we need to protect the common goods that are common and open digital infrastructure. Today, a European innovator has to make use of a whole set of resources, infrastructure, data, payment systems that are the property of monopolistic players. And these through terms of reference and conditions which define themselves and without consultation set their own rules. And since we do not have a hegemonic vision of sovereignty, we would like the digital world to instead be organized around common goods that are not captured by those who hold de facto monopolies on computing power, master the technology, or exert financial domination. This is why we need to remain vigilant to protect and develop common, open digital infrastructure that is usable by all and improvable by all. Regarding all of these issues, France would like to gather with willing European countries to launch reflection on European digital sovereignty in 2020. And I have the feeling that this reflection very much is coherent with what we've heard earlier today. Dear friends, I'm sorry for being so long, but to conclude, I would like to say that if there is one thing we learned from 1989, it is that history is not linear. It is now considered good form to denounce Western arrogance, which, in light of the collapse of the Soviet bloc, declared it a victory for liberal democracy and the market economy. But the democratic determinism of the time should not be followed 30 years later by some sort of populist determinism. In light of the rise of populism, in light of the questioning of the liberal democracy model and the challenging of multilateralism, some have predicted an end to liberal order, a new end of history, a new reverse ending to the history in a way, which would seem more like a cautious withdrawal than a rosy future. And yet, the real lesson of 1989 is that history is never written in advance, and that it is the peoples that write it. We can only welcome this as political leaders. It is great news, indeed, because this means that Europeans are free to determine their future. And by working together, they will be able to create and defend models for society and international governance in which they believe. And as Václav Havel once said, the spirit of resistance and courage pay. But 1989 has undoubtedly has probably not yet kept all of its promises. Is this a reason to give into the prevailing disillusion? I don't think so. I see it more as an additional reason for Europeans to band together and continue working to write their common history. I believe it is the best way to remain true to the spirit of 1989 and pay tribute to those who 30 years ago, with their faith, their endurance, their enthusiasm, made history, your history, our history, for the benefit of our common Europe, a free, sovereign, and humanist Europe. Accordingly, in order to encourage you to dip into the force of 1989 to better build the Europe of tomorrow together, let me conclude my remarks by referring to the wise philosophy of Nietzsche, who suggested that nurturing the past while building the future, such shall be our present. Thank you.